Hey, welcome everybody back to the new episode of the Big and Doug Carmi Show, your one-stop shop for all things Commanders. We're going to take a look around the NFL today, and to do that, the senior writer from The Athletic, Ted Wood, is our guest today. Ted, how are you, man?
Doing good. How are you?
Good. It's been a while since we've had you on. Appreciate a little bit of time. I feel like we always learn something new when you're on. It's been interesting with the playoffs. They've been fantastic this year.
Yeah.
Part of that, it feels like to me, Ted, is we were missing, not missing some of the blue bloods that we're used to seeing, and we got to look at some of the up and coming teams. How have you found the playoffs so far, and what kind of was your biggest takeaway or shock so far?
Yeah, it's been an awesome playoffs. So many one-score games that go down to the very last second. I thought the Broncos game was good, but to be honest, I'm not a big fan of when the weather
I agree.
completely obliterates a game like that because it just becomes a contest of who could suck less. And
Exactly.
um, once the Patriots had the lead, like nobody was scoring from that point, and it was rough. So I hated that the game had to go that way. But it was still a good game with some good defenses there, and obviously we had the Rams and Seahawks game, which was one of the best games of the entire season, honestly. So can't ask for much more than that. And like I mentioned, this entire playoffs just has been phenomenal. So many good games.
It's been an interesting match between head coaches. We've got a bunch that are defensive minded in the playoffs so far, and a bunch of some of these young gunners at offense. If you were starting, the easy answer I feel like is if you're starting a franchise and you want a head coach, you go offense because the game is so dictated by offense, and we know what happens to defensive head coaches that have good offensive coordinators. You're constantly rotating them. Where do you stand on that side?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, like you mentioned, you want that young offensive coordinator that can just be your play caller for life. Because um, anytime you have a young play caller, if you're a CEO type of coach and he has a good year, that guy is leaving. But we've seen plenty of CEO type of coaches have success in this league too. There's something to say about guys that don't have to call the game, that could game manage a little bit better when they're not burdened with having to call the game. But I think the number one thing is you have to be able to identify coaching talent, and you have to be able to hire well. But the thing is, even if you hire well, sometimes you just hit a snag. Sometimes a guy isn't who you thought he was going to be, and then hopefully that doesn't tank your season. But if you're a good enough defensive coach, then even if you're not calling a defense, the hope is that your defense will be so good that it could carry your team even if the offense has an off year. And that's what happened with Houston. Houston had a couple of bad offensive coordinator hires with Slowick and actually, I wouldn't say Cali was bad, but the offense was bad. I mean, I think a lot of it had to do with the offensive line. But their defense was so dominant that they were in the divisional game with a chance to make the AFC Championship.
Ted, you set me up very nicely. Actually, you talked about CEO coach and talking about new hires here. Washington had basically a flip flop in regard to their seasons the last 2 years: 12-5 one year, 5-12 this last year. A lot of injuries, a lot of turnovers there. I'm curious from a national perspective, what's your viewpoint of Washington and what went wrong? And then on top of that, we've seen two new hires, David Blau and Durante Jones, hired here in DC. Is that indicative of the confidence that Dan Quinn potentially, he maybe has a stable job, or could it also be maybe it's less desirable? Maybe that's all we could potentially get here in DC because the hiring cycle may not have been drawn to DC. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the issue with Dan Quinn is, like I mentioned, if you're going to be that defensive CEO head coach, your defense better be able to carry you even through rough times with the offense. And
Mm-hmm.
it's been opposite. The defense has been among the worst in the
Mm-hmm.
league. So I mean, I think they had some moments the year before when they made the NFC Championship, but this year they were just awful. There's no way around it. And I think the hires that they've made, I think, are showing that Dan Quinn is willing to go away from his normal identity. Hiring a guy from Minnesota who has a very opposite philosophy of Dan Quinn's roots as far as being kind of conservative. And I know he's played more man coverage ever since breaking away from that Seattle system, but it's going to be a completely different system, presumably, with a lot of blitzing, a lot more aggression, a lot more movement pre-snap. And I think with the offensive coordinator hire, um, I think that's a move to move towards a more traditional type of under center offense, and it's a move to try to preserve Jaden Daniels as well, not being reliant, because that was a one huge knock on Cliff Kingsbury forever, going back to his days with the Cardinals. Is his offense is too reliant on the quarterback run and too reliant on quarterback scrambles. Kyler Murray had a tough time staying healthy. Jaden Daniels took a ton of hits in his rookie year, but was able to survive. And this year, his injury luck wasn't as good. So I think going to a under-center offense that could blend some Kingsbury ideas that will take less hits on him will be better for him. But again, those two hires, I think, just broke away from Dan Quinn's typical philosophy, especially one that he established in that year where they went to the NFC Championship. And I think it's a good sign that he's willing to do that, but also kind of it could be seen as a bad sign that they wanted him to make all these changes on the staff. Usually when something like that happens, a coach is on the hot seat.
Absolutely.
Yes, and it doesn't feel like from people we've talked to that he's on the hot seat by any means. With moving David Blau up, for those that watch this show, we had always assumed it was going to be Tavita Pritchard. Of course, Tavita gets his shot at Stanford, and I respect him for taking the job because it seems perfect for him. And it's one of these things where around here, of course, we know Sean McVay and Quinn kind of had that issue in Atlanta when he went with Sarkisian. I wonder how much of it went into Dan Quinn saying, I'm not going to be bamboozled again. We're not going to let this guy out of the building. We've got to do it now. However, if we looked at both jobs, the offensive coordinator job probably would have been fairly enticing to a lot of offensive coordinators. The defensive coordinator spot, I guess I could see where there's not a lot of talent there, where you might have to go looking for a guy. I also find it interesting, kind of a two-part here, to the league in general feels like it's going towards pass game coordinators or run game coordinators, the guys that are third down the tree of a really good offense or a really good defense. Are you surprised by that?
No, I think with how important running the ball is now, especially with defenses moving towards lighter boxes, lighter bodies, all the really good teams know how to run the ball. And it's not just like, well, we're going to commit to running the ball and do 20 carries a game. You have to be creative with the ways you run the ball, with motion, how you use personnel, and you have to be creative with how you punish defenses. So I think every team is looking for that type of balance right now, but it's not an easy balance to achieve, and it does take some ingenuity. So I think that's part of the appeal of Blau, is he did coach under Ben Johnson, and Ben Johnson is kind of like the pinnacle of offensive scheme right now. So I think there's that approach, that appeal. And then he also learned from Kingsbury, so he has some of that quarterback run game stuff that he could bring in offense. And I think it just represents a balance of what they're trying to achieve and some of the current offensive meta as well.
Ted, you talked about how our defense could potentially change next year. Dan Quinn, stereotypically back in Seattle, kind of played a cover three, kind of a soft coverage. He tried to bring more man-match concepts over here in DC. We didn't have the personnel for it. We had some injuries as well. Now we're going to more aggressive concepts of potentially the Brian Flores tree here. I believe you wrote a really good article about Brian Flores and the whole think tank that he had over in Minnesota. Can you touch on that for our viewers that haven't read the article about, what was that Minnesota think tank like? How did it work? And what could we potentially see here in DC?
Yeah. When I did talk to Flores, you don't typically hear defensive coordinators describing themselves this way, but he said he considers himself a creative. And it's really hard to create schemes in today's league. Football's been around forever. We've seen so many different cycles, so it's really hard to create something new. But Flores was able to do that with the Vikings, and part of how he did that was he just tried to come up with crazy ideas. Like it was a intent to try to come up with stuff that nobody's done, and part of that creative philosophy was done with his veterans on those Vikings team. They would meet, they would come up with ideas, and then they would try to come up with the ways they could achieve that idea. Like, can we run this coverage with this blitz? Can we show this look and then come in and then all of a sudden morph into this look? Like, how can we do that? Obviously, not every idea is going to make it past the cutting room floor, but a lot of it did, and that's the product that we saw with the Vikings. That's one of the reasons why teams were so afraid to pass it on the Vikings, because you're just going to see looks that you haven't seen before, and it's hard. It's scary as a coach if you don't know what you're going to see, and just to prepare your team for those type of things that you're not really prepared for.
Mm.
Does this suggest to you, I guess it does to me, that they actually were super interested in Flores, and that when he didn't go, they thought they were getting the next better thing?
I'm sure a lot of teams with defensive coordinator openings would be extremely interested in Flores. I never thought he was going to leave for a lateral job,
Right.
Unless he just had some bad relationships with the Vikings, but it seems like they really love him there. So, except for Mike Pettin, obviously, but yeah, I think, I had a hard time seeing him leave, but I do wonder if he's going to go full Flores. Like, is he really going to try to emulate everything they did there because it was so unique? And it could definitely blow up in your face too. I mean, so like you could be ultra aggressive, you could try all these things, but if you don't have the right mix of guys from an intelligent standpoint that could execute those things and make the checks and all those things, and the Vikings have a lot of veteran defenders as well, it could blow up in your face. So I don't know if it's going to look exactly like it did with the Vikings, but I think he'll take some of those principles. I think he'll take that idea and try to establish that culture of being collaborative and shape shifting. But we'll see how it plays out. I mean, you need some guys there that with some experience in the scheme before you could really do what you want.
Real quick, George. A lot of the fan base here, Ted, were highly in on Scott from Seattle. If it was your pick to make, which way would you have gone?
I like their choice. I mean, I think Seattle, you're going to try to kind of emulate that Fangio philosophy mixed with some blitzing, Martindale philosophies. But I just think the Seattle scheme is harder to emulate because, you're going to try to defend a run from light boxes. You're going to try to play sub personnel, but if you can't stop the run, it's really hard to emulate from place to place. I think, whereas we talked about how hard the Viking system is to emulate, but at least you're gonna have some aggression. I would rather go out swinging with aggression than try to play kind of a more
100%.
softer philosophy and just get ran over because you don't have the guys up front.
No, I agree 100%. So Doug and I were talking off the line, Cliff Kingsbury, right? We're surprised that he still has a vacant position. He hasn't locked into a coaching spot yet. We actually had Ben Albright on last week, and he potentially linked, I guess, him to the Ravens as offensive coordinator. I don't know if they filled up that position there yet. I guess I have a two-part question for you. Cliff Kingsbury, I thought, was a good transition coach as Jaden Daniels came into the NFL, kind of gave him an easy step into the league with some familiar concepts there. But some people have said maybe the air raid might be becoming outdated or predictable, kind of that cliff, if you will, and if you agree with that potentially. And then on two, I guess, what's your overall perception of Jaden Daniels now? I know he was considered all-world last year. He was considered, a rising star, but he had some injuries this year. Do you have any? Is there any chinks in the armor potentially, or do you kind of wave that to an injury-plagued year last year?
Yeah, I think Cliff would do well with the Baltimore Ravens. I think, yeah, I mean, I just think he needs to have some balance. Like, you can't be no huddle all the time, and the league is trending towards having a real under center package now. So I think that's part of the reason why he was let go is, he's just almost always shotgun, always no huddle. And obviously that works to a degree, but you run into a wall eventually. And they did it in Washington. I think Jaden Daniels is still a rising star. Obviously the injuries happen and they've taken steps towards keeping him more upright this season. But I just think the big thing is just how hard he works, how hard he prepares, and the improvements that we've seen going back to college. So I think maybe next year we'll see some growing pains because he's going to be asked to do things that he hasn't been asked to do ever in his entire football playing career. So there might be some growing pains, but I think ultimately this will be a good move for him, and I don't see why he wouldn't be able to learn how to play under center and execute these play actions and things at a higher volume than he has before.
You talked about the no huddle, and I think it was Sam Cosme on with B. Mitch and Finley from the radio show like a week ago, who said we'd actually like to be able to get up to the line a little bit, diagnose the play for a couple of seconds, maybe see some guys moving around, and then snap the ball rather than, because it was funny. They did a lot of no huddle, but they also they weren't always just snapping the ball immediately. They kind of go through it and then see it. But I know those guys wanted to be up there. Then he can make his call so that they could see what was going on. And I think that will help everybody. Obviously, when the offensive line comes out and says, or at least one of the leaders of the offensive line says, hey, this will be a good thing for us, I believe it. And so it will be interesting to see that West Coast type offense should open up the running game and, the bootleg with Jaden's. It's the funny thing, right, Ted? Because quarterbacks don't generally get hurt in the pocket or bootlegs. It's on just random quarterback scrambles, technically, and I think most people don't realize that. Ted, if you were starting franchises all over today, which 5 players would you start your NFL franchise with? Like top 5 players you'd start a franchise with.
I don't want to go all quarterbacks, but I mean it's just the most important position in football. So to me, I mean, I still think Patrick Mahomes is the number 1 quarterback in football. He'd be number 1. Josh Allen is number 2. I'm a big Justin Herbert believer. I do think that he has to get that playoff monkey off his back, but I thought last season it was just, like when you get hit that much, it eventually affects
crazy.
you. Right?
Yeah.
How will that marriage go? How do you find that marriage in San Diego?
I honestly think
LA now, but
I think that hire was a league altering type of hire. I think it's a home run hire. Greg Roman, he can only take you so far, and I think he was good for kind of establishing Harbaugh's culture, and he kind of gave that offense a solid baseline. But there's just so many limitations with his pass game that they ran into there, and it wasn't all his fault. That offensive line was just like banged up beyond imagined.
Yeah.
So I think it wasn't all his fault, but I think Mike McDaniel is one of the best play callers in the league, most creative play callers in the league. And one of the big things he talked about in yesterday's press conference was Herbert's amazing. He can make all these amazing plays, but you don't need to rely on those amazing plays all the time. It's just too much to ask of him. And one of the things that he's going to do is he's going to give him a ton of layup type of throws that he's never had in his career before, with scheme and play action, RPOs, and all those things. And you combine that with just how, all the amazing throws he can make. I think next year is going to be a year where the Chargers, and I'm not one of those guys that are always hyping up the Chargers in offseason, but I think, this hire is going to be perfect. I think the one thing that McDaniel kind of struggled with is creating a tough, hard-running football team when he was the head coach in Miami, but that's not going to be something you have to worry about with Jim Harbaugh. Right. Jim Harbaugh is going to, he's going to establish that physical identity. I think it's just such a great blend with those two.
I was actually going to ask you that question. I was curious what your favorite coaching dynamic positions would be this offseason. I think the McDaniel one in LA is a home run as well. We see Harbaugh going to the Giants. We see Stefanski moving around to the Falcons as well. I guess two-part question. What's your favorite match of team and coach? And then two, I guess as an NFC East perspective, the Eagles coordinator position, the offensive coordinator position, it seems like, I mean, they're contenders every single year, but they can't fill it up for whatever reason. Do you have any idea why, in your opinion, as well?
Yeah, I think Jalen Hurts has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
You know, like he's just a guy that doesn't pass down the middle of the field, and Eagle fans, they just don't want to accept it. But he, over his entire career, he's thrown to the middle of the field the least frequent of any quarterback. You could look at the statistics. I mean, it just shows up there, and I think the Eagle fans believe that it's because of Nick Sirianni, but I truly believe he just doesn't like to throw to the middle of the field. And a lot of mobile quarterbacks are like that. Russell Wilson was like that. Jaden Daniels is like that to a degree, but I could see him learning to throw to the middle of the field a little bit more. And he's improved in the area, but he's still a guy that is just not willing to throw over in the middle of the field a lot. I think a lot of it has to do with how they grew up playing football. If you grow up playing football, not having to make those tight window anticipation passes, because if it's not open, you can just take off, and it's just much easier to read things from the outside in. Then that's just how you're going to play. And I think that's just how Jalen Hurts has played his whole career. And he said he wants to throw it to the middle of the field a little bit more, but I think it's just a hard thing to learn to do at this point of his career. And with the Eagles, I think there's only so much credit you can get, even if you have a successful year too. So it's just not an attractive job. And plus, they might lose AJ Brown. And if you lose AJ Brown, that's a huge part of the offense that gets removed. So it is a tough job. I'm not saying that it's the worst job, but it's just not as attractive as it would seem with all the talent that they have on that side of the ball.
Yeah, I think with AJ Brown, it's like it's almost inevitable that there is going to be a breakup, and I think all parties want a breakup, but it's going to be a net loss, right? Like they thrive with AJ Brown there. He's a perfect complement to Devontae Smith. You kind of need that big man, route runner on the other side for Devontae Smith. It's going to be interesting. They will take a step back, in my opinion, if he leaves. So interesting.
Are the Cowboys going to figure out a way to pay George Pickens?
I mean, it just seems like such a Jerry Jones thing to do, like, the big flashy wide receiver. Like, he loves headlines, he loves flash, he loves putting points on the board. I mean, I cannot imagine them letting George Pickens leave that building. I mean, I think they would much rather pay somebody like Pickens than Micah Parsons. It just seems like a Jerry World thing to do.
Very Jerry World.
I got two more for you. I'm just curious if you'd rank the NFC East as far as the head coaches go now, and then of course we've got to get your Super Bowl pick before you get out of here.
Gotcha. So sorry, could you repeat that question?
Rank the NFC East coaches for me real quick.
All right. So NFC East, I would say. I got to put John Harbaugh at 1. I would put John Harbaugh at 1. I mean, you just got to respect the consistency he's had year to year. Every single year dealing with a ton of injuries and still making the playoffs. And obviously, the playoff record is disappointing. And to Nick Sirianni, I think he has a Super Bowls. You got to respect the Super Bowls. There's some question to. How many people could have done that job, but at the end of the day, he has the ring, so you got to put him number 2. And I put Dan Quinn 3. I mean, Dan Quinn made the NFC Championship last year. He's been in this league a long time. He's made a Super Bowl before too, and then 4 would be Schottenheimer. Really, he hasn't accomplished enough to really be say that he could be 1 or 2 or 3 over those guys. I think he had a good surprising year. I think he could be a good coach moving forward. And he definitely surprised me. I did not have high expectations of him based on the process the Cowboys went through to
I agree
hire
with
him
that.
as head coach. I think Clayton Adams, who his offensive coordinator and offensive line coach, is a phenomenal coach, and I wonder how Schottenheimer is going to do if Clayton Adams ever leaves for another job.
Real quick, Ted, are the Giants a playoff team with John Harbaugh at the coach right now? I think their over/under is 8.5 right now, which is kind of interesting because I think they do have some talent. They have Jackson Dart, Cam Scotaba, Blake Neighbors. Their whole defensive line is pretty strong, but they just seem to always be out of it every year. But do you think Harbaugh is a stabilizing presence now?
They still need an offensive coordinator. They lost out on Todd Monken, who surprisingly got hired by the Browns. So that's going to be a huge hire. That could be a potential Cliff Kingsbury spot as well. Could be maybe he goes back to Greg Roman. The Harbaugh brothers always seem to find their way back to Greg Roman. But that's going to be a huge hire. I think they definitely have talent, though. I mean, Jackson Dart going to year 2 definitely needs to protect himself. The offensive line is a solid offensive line. We'll see what happens with Malik Neighbors if he could come back from his injury and play at a high level. Defensively, they underachieved last year defensively. They have some guys to be a much better defense than they were, especially at pass rush. They were just a mess on that side of the ball. So I think Denard Wilson will do a good job just kind of solidifying that defense. I think there's still too many question marks to say that they will be a playoff team, but they will be a better team, and they have potential to be if they ace that OC hire and they add some talent. And I don't think they need a ton of talent, but because I do like some of their young pieces, and I think they need to develop those guys rather than spend on veterans and that will take too much PT away from those young guys. So maybe borderline playoff team if they get the hire right and add some pieces.
Who you got for the Super Bowl?
I like Seattle. I just think they've been one of the best teams all year. They have the best defense in the league. Sam Darnold was the big question mark. How could he perform in big games? And he answered that thoroughly in that NFC Championship game. I did not expect him to have the game he did, and that was the best game I've ever seen him play.
He balled out.
Yeah, and I think New England has one of the luckier path to the Super Bowl that I remember. Really easy regular season where they saw backups and fired coaches and that sort of thing, and then you play against a really banged up Chargers team. CJ Stroud turned the ball over 100 times, and then you play against Jarrett Stidham in a snowstorm. I think they're a good team. Drake May deserves the MVP if he wins it. Mike Vrabel has done a phenomenal job. I just don't think they're in the class with Seattle. I think the one thing they could muck this game up with is if Christian Barmore and Milton Williams just destroy that interior of that Seattle line and make life hard on Sam Darnold. But if they find ways to midgetate that and they can run the ball, I think Seattle's going to win pretty easily.
Ted, you're the best, man. Thank you so much for giving us some time, and can't wait to do it again.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, I appreciate it, man.